Although the war between Russia and Ukraine is mostly fought on land, the conflict also extends to the maritime domain. Despite Ukraine's limited naval assets, its military has successfully operated in the Black Sea, where Russia restricts access to Ukrainian shores. Ukraine's asymmetrical capabilities in the Black Sea provide valuable lessons for countries seeking to defend against superior naval forces, even without significant resources or political will to build a large navy. Recently, Ukrainian forces have concentrated their efforts on the left bank of the Dnipro River. In a nighttime operation, Russian forces launched sea-based cruise missiles from an underwater carrier in the Black Sea, targeting Odessa. However, the Ukrainian air defense forces effectively intercepted and destroyed all 4 missiles before they reached the coast. Throughout the day, Russian forces continued to bombard and carry out airstrikes on the right bank of the Dnipro estuary, particularly the Kinburn Bank. They utilized offensive drones, anti-aircraft missiles, and artillery. However, Ukrainian missile and artillery units, in collaboration with the Air Force, inflicted significant losses on the enemy during their firing missions. The command center of a Russian army brigade in the Sadovsky district was struck, resulting in the destruction of all Russian assault boats present. In another significant achievement, the Ukrainian armed forces successfully defeated the entire fleet of Russian army ships in Skadovsk. This operation, conducted during the night, caused powerful explosions and resulted in the destruction of approximately 24 boats that had been re-equipped by Russian troops. The Ukrainian Army Southern Operational Command confirmed that the operation destroyed a total of 21 Russian warboats, dealing a heavy blow to the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Additionally, 2 Russian field supply points were destroyed in the neighboring district of Kakhovka. The Russian Ministry of Defense claimed that the intelligence ship Vishnya-class Pryazovia was attacked by up to 6 remotely controlled unmanned surface vehicles in the central part of the Black Sea. However, the Kremlin released a video claiming that Pryazovia successfully repelled the attack, with no casualties or damage to the ship. The authenticity of the video, which was shot in daylight, raises doubts. Furthermore, Moscow suggested that a U.S. Air Force surveillance drone had assisted Ukrainian resources in targeting the ship, similar to the Rustavi attack on the Russian ship Ivan Kurs in May. These incidents highlight the escalating tensions in the Black Sea. Despite the challenges posed by the Russian occupation of Crimea, Ukraine has managed to maintain a credible naval deterrent using asymmetrical capabilities such as naval mines, anti-ship missiles, and unmanned surface ships. These capabilities, coupled with armed drones, have effectively limited the movements of Russian surface fleets and played a vital role in defending Ukrainian interests. Shifting focus to the Ukrainian front lines, the initial phase of the Ukrainian offensive has been ongoing for 3 weeks. The UK Ministry of Defense reported that Russia has relocated a significant portion of the Dnipro forces group from the east bank of Kherson Oblast to Zaporizhia and Bakhmut. A Russian military blogger confirmed Ukrainian forces' strategic offensive in areas northwest, northeast, and southwest of Bakhmut. Ukrainian troops possess detailed intelligence on the composition and commanders of the Russian troops across the front line, enabling them to plan their offensive actions accordingly. Approximately 25% of Ukrainian forces participated in these successful offensive operations, liberating an area of 113 kilometers squared in southern Ukraine. Russian forces, anticipating a counterattack, fortified their positions and deployed 90% of their reserves while only employing 25% of Ukrainian forces. The Russians were well prepared, but Ukraine had knowledge of their training methods. Russian troops now employ aviation and electronic warfare more actively. Despite this, Ukrainian troops continue to advance in coordinated small groups, maintaining a real-time battlefield picture and making quick decisions. Small unit commanders have autonomy in tactical decision-making without constant consultation, thanks to the use of high-quality equipment provided by allies, superior combat skills, and modern battle tactics. The tactical prowess of Ukrainian soldiers yields significant gains on the front lines. Most of Ukraine attacks are held in reserve as the troops launch probing attacks. Ukraine troops are waiting for a sufficiently large opening in the Russian defense to launch a main offensive and to try retake territory in the south of the country. Ukrainian troops are attacking at 3 points. As it is known, the heart of the war continues to beat in the east and south axis. They advance north and south of Tyler, Russian-controlled city of Bakhmut, south of Zaporizhia, and in southern Donetsk, where several villages were recaptured. The Kiev forces are advancing decisively in these directions, liberating the Russian-occupied areas and reflying their national flags there. Ukraine's long-awaited counteroffensive has allowed Kiev to gain ground from Russian forces in recent days. The most intense fighting in the last few days has focused on the western parts of the Donetsk region and the Zaporizhia region. In southern Ukraine, the Ukrainian armed forces liberated a total of 8 settlements. Novorivka Levany Stroy Evmakivka Blagodany Lobkovna Skichny Pyatakotki said the Ukrainian fighters regained full control over Pyatakotki. They captured a large number of Russian ammunition from the 128th Assault Brigade. Interestingly, Russian sources claimed yesterday that they were tactically withdrawing and returning to safer positions around the settlement. However, Russian sources later admitted that the Ukrainian troops attacked them from both sides, cut off their retreat, imprisoned them in a pocket, and destroyed the Storm Ossetian battalion with their commander. This means that more than 300 Russian soldiers and their equipment were destroyed. In line with this, Moscow forces battling against Kiev's continued counterattack are suffering the highest casualties since the peak of the battle for the destroyed city of Bakhmut in Ukraine earlier this year. According to a new assessment, Russian soldiers cannot withstand the pressure of Ukrainian troops. Unable to withstand this pressure, the Russians are fleeing from the front in the face of the Ukraine offensive. According to the Ukrainian military, Russian fighters are fleeing the front line in eastern Ukraine as Kiev's counterattack gains momentum in its operational update. The General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces stated that Moscow troops are moving away from the front lines in the disputed eastern Luhansk region. The Ukrainian General Staff reported that a group of Russian soldiers described as mobilized forces who had fled their positions were found in the Ukrainian village of Novoazovsk. It was stated that the search operations for the fleeing soldiers were also carried out by the Russian National Guard. In fact, desertion has become a documented problem in Russian forces in Ukraine. In November 2022, the UK Ministry of Defense stated that Kremlin generals may have authorized the use of weapons against deserters, including allowing fire to kill such offenders after a warning has been given. For example, earlier this month, footage circulating in Ukrainian media showed Moscow troops firing at their retreating soldiers. The tactic of shooting deserters probably testifies the low quality, low morale, and discipline of the Russian forces. Also, the escape and surrender of the Russians had been repeated for a very long time. In the last days of May, several dozen armed convicts fleeing the Luhansk region caused turmoil in Rostov. 39 armed soldiers from the Stormzy detachment fled Lysychansk, Ukraine's occupied Luhansk region. The deserted soldiers were all ex-convicts who went to fight under contract. During the escape, a soldier from the self-proclaimed LPR Ministry of State Security was killed while the soldiers were trying to stop the fugitives. Previously, Russia had created military prisons to hold mobilized soldiers who were detained and arrested. Such a step was taken to reduce the number of cases of desertion and voluntary desertion of troops, which have recently become more frequent in the Army of Russian Federation. In addition, the situation was quite dire for the soldiers who could not escape from the front lines. Russia and Ukraine often share casualty numbers for the opposing side. In tally published last morning, the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces announced that 650 Russian soldiers had withdrawn from the operation in the last 24 hours. The previous day, again, the Ukrainian army stated that Russia lost 670 soldiers. Bearing the brunt of months of fierce fighting, Bagwin claims that Russia forces have taken control of the settlement, but Ukraine denies this and continues to fight. Indeed, it is very difficult to determine casualties in an ongoing conflict because both sides try to keep the data secret and increase the number of enemies' casualties. But there is an evidence that within a week of Ukraine's summer offensive, Ukraine captures dozens of POWs. It is stated that since the beginning of the summer offensive in early June, the Ukrainian army has captured from 5 to 10 Russian service personnel per day in the Donbass and Zaporizhia regions. In fact, according to a study, most surrendered only after the AFU infantry had passed their positions. The fact that a total of 70 or more Russian posts were rounded up over a 7-day period matches the capture rate set in the early days of the war, when signs of weakening Russian army morale were significant. Russian soldiers assigned to the front fortifications near the village of Novogeorgiyevka in the Zaporizhia region was captured by Ukrainian troops. Captured Russian soldier claimed that Russian artillery and tanks did not support his unit during the war. Another POW stated that his defensive positions had 3 tanks supporting him, but only 2 of the vehicles were crewed. Several other POWs reported dematerialization in their units. On the other hand, there was no conclusive evidence in the videos of the physical abuse of Russian POWs by personnel of the Ukrainian armed forces. Russian prisoner of war made it clear that Ukraine's treatment of them was good. Some POWs had visible wounds, but most said the ones were the results of conflict. Some videos showed that while Ukrainian army medics were treating Russian POWs, shells and mortar shells occasionally infested the nearby area. When we look at the approach of the Russian army to the Ukrainian prisoners of war, we can say that Ukraine's attitudes towards the invaders is so human that it is an indication that Putin's pressure will not prevail in these lands. Both Russian and Ukrainian troops suffered heavy casualties as Kiev regained Moscow-controlled territory along the front lines. The UK Ministry of Defense said yesterday there were 26 conflicts in which Moscow troops focused on Bakhmut, as well as the Donetsk cities of Lyman, Avdiivka and Marinka. The Institute of War Studies, a U.S. think tank that monitors the war in Ukraine, said that Kiev fighters carried out counterattack operations in at least 4 areas of the front line. The critical war between Ukraine and Russia almost divided Donbass into 2 fronts. The Luhansk region on the one side and the Donetsk region on the other are seen as the last exit points for Russian and Ukrainian soldiers on the front line on their way home. But for a group of Russian troops of the Second Cause of the Russian Federation in Luhansk, this door was completely closed. There is a serious panic in the city, and the Russians in the region are forcing Russia's doors on the Ukraine-Russia border. Putin's recognition of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic marked a turning point in the months-long escalation before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Today, this decision of Putin still determines the direction of the course of the war and clashes. In addition, the Ukrainian war continues to progress largely as a trench war. Tanks, which are indispensable in land battles, come to the fore in these regions as well. A full trench and a tank war is going on in this region. Clashes and offensive operations, on the other hand, affect the Russians in Donbass in a very negative way. The Russian troops, which have begun to feel this effect deeply in recent days, are losing heavy casualties, especially in the Luhansk region. At least 4 Russian infantry soldiers were eliminated last day, thanks to the coordinated efforts of the aerial reconnaissance and mortar unit of the Luhansk detachment of the Ukrainian State Border Guard Service. WAV operators in the Ukrainian army, on the other hand, uncovered a Russian infantry cluster. After that, Russian troops settled in a farmhouse in the Luhansk region. The mortar team of the Ukrainian Border Guard launched a fire attack on this very area. The mortar attack carried out gave positive results. The Russian infantry group, unable to escape the artillery fire of the Ukrainian forces, was blown up and destroyed. In addition, at least 1 Russian truck was destroyed as a result of artillery attacks. It was learned that the soldiers who could not escape the Ukrainian artillery fire in the Luhansk region belonged to the Luhansk Second Army Cause. Another critical issue is that the losses in Luhansk reached very serious figures in Novopskov in the Luhansk region. The Russians began to build a crematorium due to the impossibility of getting their soldiers out of the clash's trenches. Luhansk Regional Governor Sergei Haidai emphasized this in a post he shared on Telegram. On this subject, Sergei Haidai said that information that the Russians started digging a pit near Novopskov have been discussed for a long time. Of course, this is not for the construction of a hospital, school or kindergarten. This was originally for the construction of a new crematorium because they have no place to put all these losses. According to Haidai, the Russian command has an interesting tactic. New units of newly mobilized soldiers, regular units or Kadyrovites, were isolated from each other, stopping any communication between the newly arrived soldiers. In addition, Russian troops conduct reconnaissance through warfare. As a result of these constant attacks, there were many dead and wounded. Russian commanders are trying to prevent panic among the fighters by isolating the units from each other. On the other hand, while the casualties of the Russian troops in Luhansk are increasing day by day, there is an atmosphere of panic in the city. The heavy losses suffered by the 1st and 2nd Russian Army Corps deployed in the occupied region of the Ukrainian Donbass aroused complete indignation among the relatives of the soldiers in these Russian cause. The families and relatives of these soldiers in these 2 Russian Kurs continued their escape preparations by selling their immovable property and their other valuables. In addition, relatives of other Russian soldiers in Donbass were also involved in these escape plans. In Donetsk, with a population of 1 million, currently 300,000 Russians, and in Luhansk, with a population of more than 500,000, 200,000 Russian citizens are preparing to leave the Donbass region completely. So in total, 500,000 Russians took action to return to their own country. Some of the Russian citizens who wanted to escape from Donbass had been staying in this region for a long time. However, due to the situation getting out of control in the region, these Russian citizens joined the families and relatives of the Russian soldiers in the 1st and 2nd Russian cause to leave the place where they had lived for a long time. Currently, for about a week, all the train stations that the Russians control in Donbass are flooded with people. Russians who wanted to leave this region generally prefer the train route, but there are also Russian citizens trying to escape from Donbass by land. It shows that the situation on the front lines of Donbass has seriously affected the soldiers of the Russian army. The reason for this is that most of the fleeing Russian citizens are families or relatives of soldiers in the 1st and 2nd Russian army. Because we will understand that the offensive operations carried out by the Ukrainian forces in the last few weeks have deeply affected the Russians in the Donbass region. So what are the features of the Luhansk 2nd cause? Let's examine this cause together in detail. The transformation of the so-called Novorossiya militia units into a viable military force modeled after the Russian army began after the end of active hostilities in 2015. This process aimed to create a homogeneous semi-military structure. Republican factions could not unite due to internal clashes and differences in domains. Thus, the military strength of this group was divided into 2 corps. As a result, 2 different military forces emerged: the 1st Russian cause in the Donetsk People's Republic and the 2nd Russian cause in the Luhansk People's Republic. The transition to trench warfare made it possible to eventually transform dozens of real and virtual battalions and groups into brigades and regiments of the 1st and 2nd cause, and equip them for combat. Brigades were also deployed to Russian standards with a dual command structure to ensure their subordination in the Russian army. The dual command structure is supported by Russian inspectors who replicate all command positions at the brigade and battalion levels. By design, those who formally command these brigades are actual commanders rather than locals. But while these official commanders were actively touted in separatist and Russian media to bolster narratives of the civil war and locals taking up arms to defend their lands, de facto operational control remained firmly in the hands of the Russians. Now, due to the escalation of the Ukrainian war, the LPR 2nd Army Corps has become part of the Russian armed forces. Russia's TASS news agency reported that the 1st Donetsk and 2nd Guards, Luhansk Severodonetsk Corps, were included in the Russian armed forces. Referring to the Ministry of Defense, reports that Russian President Vladimir Putin presented these military formations with war colors. The ceremony took place on December 31, 2022, at the Southern Military District headquarters in Rostov-on-Don, with a successful offensive operations carried out by the Ukrainian armed forces. Russian troops also took serious blows on other Ukrainian front lines, including Luhansk. As a result of these heavy blows, the casualties exceeded thousands, and the brutal winds of the war also greatly affected the civilian citizens. Escapes in the Luhansk region are for now the beginning of the end. In the summer, when the mud on the front lines is completely dry, the Ukrainian armed forces will press the button to accelerate their offensive operations. As a result of these counterattacks, life will become more difficult, with the Russian troops on the front lines and the Russian civilians living there. Russian civilians who cannot stand the heat of war will find the solution by making escape plans. The Russian soldiers remaining on the front line will wait for the cold face of death to come, accompanied by an infernal landscape. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on your notifications to be instantly informed about new videos. Thank you for watching us.